This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's a sunny day outside. A little cool, but that's okay. I'm going to do some repetition today. People have had a hard time figuring out what Heartland Pathways owns as railroad beds and as other properties. So we're giving it several attempts to see if we can't get a good pin on this. I think this time we'll start from Champaign and give you an idea of what was and what might be. There were little railroad lines everywhere. They followed section lines. They were the first transportation mechanism that brought settlers to town. Oh, they weren't the first. The first were probably canoes and canals and waterways. So early development was along waterways. But the railroads also followed the waterways too. But they were more flexible. Later, motor vehicles were even more flexible than that. So we went from a horse era to a railroad era to a motor vehicle era. So little railroad lines were not awfully efficient. They'd been in action for at least 100 years, and the wooden elevators they served were small storage. The sidings for rails were limited to perhaps 15 cars. It was time for change. And in the 1980s, we'd begun to put in roads, expressways that enabled the road shipping of grain. There wasn't a great deal of taxation on road. It was convenient. The price of gasoline was reasonable, and huge supermarkets had been established that just like Cargill's or Anderson's on the west side of Champaign, which had access to main lines that were being maintained. And they were like supermarkets. They had yards that would house several trains. They could combine trains, so you could pick up from one elevator and pick up from another elevator and establish trains that were at least 125 cars. These days, manifest trains can actually run up to 200 cars miles long. Let me take you back to what was. Start out Champaign. You're going to follow the local freight train. Perhaps you're going to jump on a car and follow for fun. You probably can't ride in the driver's place. But yeah, start off with Champaign, go west to Staley, where there was a wooden elevator, to Bonneville, another wooden elevator, to Seymour, another wooden elevator, to White Heath. At White Heath, there was a junction. The train usually went southwest to Monticello, but there could be a choice to go west to Clinton. Train would go to Monticello and then southwest to Cisco and into Argenta and Oriana into Decatur. At Decatur, an alternate line took the train north to Clinton and then east to Lane, Weldon, DeLand, Lodge, and back to White Heath. So you have this circuit with a pigtail from Champaign to White Heath and a center at White Heath where you could go south or you could go west. That circuit in its day would provide people with the opportunity to travel. It probably went in the 1850s. By 1900, when electricity was established, there was a light rail interurban that paralleled. And it took passengers. You could put your hand up and it would stop, pick you up and take you along. Probably one or two cars, a little jumpy because the rails were lightweight and they traveled over the terrain. A little later, the roads came and early T-model Fords and other vehicles parallel the railroad line. Now, we're looking at inefficient elevators, short sidings, and many of them, and grain on the road. So these elevators are becoming non-functional, and so the traffic is low, and it has to go several times because the sidings were so short. So at a national level, it was decided to create a Staggers Act. That act permitted short lines to abandon if they didn't have enough usage, and the rail tracks that they were using had not been maintained, and there were derailments here and there. So if it justified, you were allowed to abandon. And that happened to this regional circuit. Not enough use, not enough maintenance, and abandonment and salvage was attractive in a way because the steel is worth a small fortune, and the ties and the gravel under the ties is also valuable. So abandonment was a option that was encouraged. You could appeal against it, that you wanted to preserve some of it, and some of it, the grain companies bought their own rail bed intact. It might be 6 or 10 miles long, and they would pick up 2 or 3 elevators that they probably owned in conjunction and trundle that grain to a main line. The main lines were being kept functional. They were heavy duty and they allowed traffic to move across the country. So although some railroads were being obsoleted, other railroads were being retained, and they move freight much more cheaply than if you were on the road, and also with a safety record that's amenable. So if we're starting at Champaign, we start somewhere between State and Randolph, where the Big Four had a yard and still does have a yard. We'll start there and move a imaginary train yourself west to Staley. The line was active at Staley as it was from downtown Champaign, Illinois Central, and Gulf. And you would go to Bonneville to Seymour. And the first abandonment was between Seymour and Whiteheath. Heartland Pathways bought that mainly because the area was alive with prairie species and prairie habitat and prairie soils. And the beds had not been maintained, so we did our best to remove trees, and railroads would do the same. At Whiteheath, the railroad was abandoned, but the Monticello Railroad Museum was wise enough to buy 7 miles of active trackage. They had started out in Champaign on a little siding near to the post office and moved to Monticello and had occupied the interurban that actually had been abandoned by the time they took over. And they had to replace the trackage, which they did. And they had a line that they could run historic cars on and give rides to interested visitors. Well, they took over the main line at Whiteheath, and it paralleled the interurban, or the interurban paralleled it. And they could make a connection between their yards and their sheds that are basically surrounding the interurban, so they could get trains shunted onto the main line. Got to be a little challenging for some people who didn't want the continuity of railroad sirens and noises and clinking clanking. But basically, the Monticello Railroad Museum maintained its dignity, and it has brought character to Monticello. It uses the southern 3 miles for tourist tracks and active line work. The northern element is still intact. They can provide services for companies that would like to store railroad vehicles in off-season or for other reasons. And that is called demurrage. And demurrage brings the Railroad Museum some income, along with paid tourist trips, and along with the rental of private equipment, cabooses, and special equipment that people cherish. It might be private or public. The demurrage is probably public ADM. So that 7 Mile is interesting, helpful in a regional planning sense. And it goes into Monticello, where a depot has been taken off of another line where it wasn't used and put in place so that it could be a headquarters for the arrival and departure of tourist trains, which are regular. The Railroad Museum bought line that had a Y at each end. A Y is a triangle. So if you take a train front ways down one side and then back ways across the other side of the triangle, then you can go forwards with the engine in front. That is called a Y. And there's one at Whiteheath and one at Monticello. The one at Whiteheath allows you to go west to Clinton if that's what you want to do, but most of these local trains went south to Monticello. There they have an access to the Norfolk Southern active line, which runs north and south. So they have an access or egress to the railroad community, and they can take historic trains out, and they can rent to people, provided the trains are up to code. And they have a connection where they can bring in steam engines that need repair or railroad equipment that needs repair. They've gradually evolved into being a service for other railroad museums. This is a national level railroad museum. And as such, it has added a lot of credentials to Monticello, which in its own right is a historic town. It has natural areas like Lodge Park, which is fantastic, especially in the spring, starting now. Today is officially spring. And Allerton Park, which is nearby, and Friends Creek, and other cultural details that are really quite interesting, along with some geology. The Cerro Gordo Moraine provides some rolling territory that gives the terrain some interest. So Heartland Pathways joins the western end of the Railroad Museum Y at Monticello. There's 6 miles of railroad bed there that runs southwest to Cisco. From Cisco, the rail has been retained as a grain line, probably about 15 miles into Decatur, where there are mainline junctions. We have gathered up Border Railroad bed in the 1980s after the Steigers Act. And we watched the rails coming out, and we figured that this could have three purposes. It could be re-railed if necessary. It could be a recreational trail with vegetation on either side, and it could be a greenway with prairie preservation and soil preservation on either side of the ballast. So rails, trails, and greenways. So we have 6 miles there to Cisco. Some of it runs past Allerton Park Farms, and the early settlement of Allerton Park by Sam Allerton, who was providing food for the Union armies in the Civil War. And he gathered up a couple of 1,000 acres there, which he eventually gave to his son. And then the son eventually gave it to the university. So we have these complexes around, which you have to consider. We did a lot to check with Top Flight Grain, which is at Cisco, to see if they ever wanted to come back through Sam Alden's elevator, through drainage basins, Willow Branch and Wildcat Creek being two, it's another little one, into Monticello. Now, if you get to Monticello with a train loaded with grain, you can then use Monticello grain lines intact to get onto Norfolk Southern and go 8 Mile to Bement, which is the headquarters of Top Flight Grain, and it's on the Wabash line, so you have a main line. Interestingly, if you have several outlets for grain, you can competitively bid for prices on grain shipment. So we were concerned that we didn't put in a trail or something that prevented Top Flight at Cisco from returning to grain, taking grain around and across the Sangamon and down to Bement and onto the Wabash line. It was considered that that was not going to happen at the present time, but we still have a railroad bed that could be converted to a rail if necessary. The city of Monticello has had an interest in these rail beds for trails. Near to the railroad headquarters at Nelson's Crossing, there is some interurban, and the Railroad Museum had not bought that for their early railroad activities, but the city bought it for a bicycle trail. So it parallels the main line that the Railroad Museum used. Uses into Monticello. It's not impossible that if the railroad were to want to come back, it could do so, but it would have to pay for a parallel popular trail on either side. The city has put their own money into creating a relatively narrow trail so that the vegetation on either side is intact, and you can enjoy it. And it goes across a truss bridge over the Sangamon where you can look at the river and look at the bottomlands and be near to a portion of the Cerro Gordo Moraine. Interesting stuff, and it's not mountainous. But it's your microcosm that you can enjoy. So the city put down a creative trail, concreted, because concrete you can replace the concrete if a tree lifts up a segment or something like that. Whereas if you do it in asphalt, you have to have a contractor. So 1 mile to County Farm Road. County Farm Road runs south to Allerton Park. So you have there a connection. That trail also connects Old Town, which is on the east side of the Sangamon River, to Newtown developments and subdivisions on the west side of Sangamon River. By popular demand, the 1 mile was extended another mile. And so there's now a rail trail 2 miles long. And it could be extended another 4 miles to Cisco to meet up with the Cisco top flight grain elevator, which runs a short line 15 mile into Decatur. The abandoned 4 miles could be created as a trail. We're rather interested in being a narrow trail so that the prairie will maintain. It's not the world's greatest prairie, but it is all that we have left. This prairie soil is very fertile and has been used for agriculture. If not for agriculture, it's used for development. There's an old highway, which was the road that paralleled the main line, and that has been retired in favor of an expressway further west. So most of the traffic is on the expressway, and the old highway, which is labeled 47, is wide and reasonably could be a shared bicycle way. So we don't have to have a huge trail through the prairie, but once you get to Cisco, you would have to be on 47 if you want to go into Decatur, which also has interesting trails in its city. So we were coming from the Champaign end to Whiteheath to Monticello, then across the Sangamon River, past Allerton Park to Cisco, past Sam Allerton's elevator, which we had thought to reconstruct as a railroad elevator, but it unfortunately got burned down. It happens. We have to preserve these sites if we want to have them go into the future. So we've lost items which could be useful. We lost a Pepsin factory, which was a prime historic example of how people found something to do in a small town. In this case, they found pepsin, an enzyme which was very helpful for diarrhea and constipation, and replaced ugly medicals that weren't very successful. This was highly successful, and unfortunately, that building was taken down. It was vacant. It was vandalized to some extent. It was uglified when these were sites that developed in a Dr. Colwell put together seneca leaves from Egypt and other places like that, which had the enzyme, squeezed them out with an apple cider press, and added a little alcohol and other goodies, and sold it as the syrup of pepsin, Dr. Caldwell's syrup of pepsin. And he had a lineup. He didn't want to be the entrepreneur for this, but he had given birth to or birthed many Monticello people, so he was a nabob in the community. Eventually, Hott and others became entrepreneurs, and a pilot house was installed as a factory, and then a 5-story factory was built around it so that the old house was in the middle E, and up to about 250 or 300 people worked at that factory. It was active till 1980s when it was sold to a multinational, and its products are still produced in other places. It was Bayer, and so the building was vacant for quite a while. But if it was understood how it fitted into the railroad wise, how it fitted into the history of Monticello, it was an artifact of historic value, even though a little decrepit, and you might need to put a $56,000 roof on it because it was leaking, and you don't have that sort of money. But at that time, vacant factories of that nature were being functionally reused. Didn't happen, and so the site is there, but it's being considered for development by the Atkins Company, and we hope it will retain a little of the history that was at that site. I think we will now go back to White Heath. And at White Heath, the line could go west. Normally, the trains, the local freight train would go south to Monticello, to Cisco, to Argenta, to Oriana, and into Decatur. Then it would go north to Clinton. And then from Clinton, it would go east back to White Heath, passing Lane, Weldon, DeLand, and Lodge. Now we have to look at the White Heath area. It's sitting on a little of the Cerro Gordo moraine, so it's a little higher than usual. The railroad line took a mile trip down to the Sangamon River. At the Sangamon River, we had one of Heartland Pathway's 3 truss bridges, and adjacent was a platted village. It was platted 30 acres for an intended village, which never happened. But the Price family, which used to own the oldest DuPont paint store in Champaign, and in the country, bought that 30 acres, had the retreat houses on it. You could rent cabins, go fishing on the Sangamon, get together as a family group or friends and relatives in a horse era day. And it was close enough to Decatur and Champaign and Clinton and other places that you could get there by horse without stressing the horse. These days, that site has been transferred to the Piatt County Forest Preserve, which has a tax base and it has in perpetuity. So we're pleased that that is in that domain, and it has been created as a soil and water conservation easement at the state level because the natural history of the site is really good. And you've got flatlands and midlands and uplands all in the same 30 acres. And you have the railroad line. So we have to think about sort of events at that site. It's not only a natural history wonder and the Sangamon River wonder, but it has the potential to have chautauquas. And it would be interesting for a novel trip to go down to Shady Rest with a train. We have lots of debate with railroad museums and others that don't want people walking down the railroad bed. It happens all the time. It used to happen when you had trains going through cities. People walked on railroad beds. And it still happens today. It's a little dangerous. It's not 80-mile-an-hour stuff. It can be 2-mile-an-hour, and trains have sirens, and there could be a little cooperation here. If not, you still have road access to Shady Rest via Shady Rest Road. So you don't necessarily have to walk down the railroad bed. But we're looking at that area because already we have established, mainly with some elements of the Monticello Railroad Museum, not all, but there's an intent to recreate a railroad bed between Whiteheath and Seymour and join established railroad, which is being abandoned between Seymour and Bonneville and Saley and Champaign. And we hope to get historic trains from the adjacent railroad museum into Champaign. It's the same group. It's called the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad. Is thinking to has asked to go down to Shady Rest. We would like them to not only go down to Shady Rest, but further across the Sangamon River on a truss bridge, across a tributary called Madden Creek, and up to Lodge. At Lodge, there is a Norfolk Southern north-south active main line that could be joined. We're dreaming that in the long run, a train from the historic Railroad Museum could go north to Whiteheath, then down a mile to Shady Rest. Let people enjoy that novelty trip and join a chautauqua and enjoy the spring herbs, and later in the year, the summer and fall activities. And then go across the Madden Creek up to Lodge, and then back down on the main line for Norfolk Southern to Monticello and back to Nelson's Crossing, which is the headquarters of the Railroad Museum. That streams. It takes 2,000 railroad ties per mile. And if you go beyond the mile down to Shady Rest, it's about 2 miles to Lodge. So you would need a lot of railroad ties. We don't have wood for that anymore, but we do have people who are working with waste materials, including plastics, that can recreate railroad ties. And it might be 50 years before you might activate that line, but we need to capture it now so that it could happen in the future. In the present, it's not unusual for railroad museums to put railroad trains on lines. They have to be responsible. They have to be meeting railroad codes. The railroad journals on the equipment have to be able to run at 80 miles an hour if necessary. The steam boilers, if it's steam, need to have boiler people in charge. But those trains can go out onto the Norfolk Southern and go to the Wabash line, which is a main line that would give another outlet to Top Flight Grain, which is headquarters at Bement. Just for fun, there's a parallel interurban, which is not used except by motorcycles, that goes straight south to Bement. And that could be activated as a trail. So we're looking at the future here. We're dreaming, but we need to leave the concept available. There was a discussion that Norfolk Southern might close out that line. If that happened, then the Railroad Museum would probably buy and use the intact working rails to allow that circuit to happen. You have to know that the Railroad Museum is a national level museum, and it has the capacity to expand. It has income from tourism, from rental of vehicles owned by privately, and from a demurrage from companies that store rail cars there. So when we're talking about preserving natural areas long between Whiteheath, between Monticello and Cisco, we have to include the Railroad Museum because it also has ballast on ballast in the center and habitat on either side. So it is possible that we might be able to do that sort of circuit in the future, especially if the Railroad Museum gets to be a national level event and brings tourism to Monticello, which has character in its own right. And it's an interesting place to come to. The site at Monticello is also near to Champaign-Urbana and to Decatur and Clinton and surrounding communities. That means that there is a population of people who are anxious to use these sort of resources. Now, having looked at that line for the local Whiteheath area and Shady Rest, we can go west from Lodge to DeLand, to Weldon, to Lane, past Weldon Springs State Park, past the cooling lake for the power plant that creates the Clinton Lake. And there's a Hensley moraine that gives the drainage basin there, which is the Salt Creek, some character. We're dreaming that that can be a rail trail. We're also interested in the vegetation on either side. Most of the adjacent owners have been very respectful of our corridor. Some have invaded to the railbed, but left us the railbed. One section has been dug on top of what is a warranty deed, which is a very good deed that we own. So we've had to have that quarter-mile documented by a surveyor, and that's expensive. We're paying $12,000 for that survey, so it will be accurate. That rail bed goes down and across the Salt Fork and waddles up around the Hensley moraine and into the east side of Clinton. Halfway along that corridor, you have an offshoot that would go north to Mansfield and join a rail trail that's coming in from Bloomington. So the Norfolk Southern is banning the railroad bed from Bloomington to Farmer City to Mansfield. That is the same line that takes grain out from Cargill. So the Cargill to Mansfield section is active. You might be able to do a trail adjacent to the rail, but for us, that takes out the vegetation and the soils that we're trying to preserve. We're down to 0.01% of what prairie we had. So the alternative is to find another way. Another way is to go south, immediately south of Mansfield, to the Heartland Pathways railbed, east of DeLand and near to Lodge. So our railbed is networking not only for people, but also for the creatures that occupy those adjacent to the ballast beds. So I think that gives you a rough idea of our territory and how it relates to other parts. The fact that we 5 miles of this bed could join Clinton Power Plant Lake and Weldon Springs State Lake is a plus. We don't have the finance that comes with the Rail Banking Act that has provided in the vicinity of $20 million for a Kickapoo Trail. But the Kickapoo Trail and the trail at Monticello is used and appreciated enough that it may encourage local phase-wise development of that corridor to Clinton. If that happens, it will upgrade the character of the small towns through which it moves. It will give income and ambiance to those towns. Not always appreciated, but quite possible, and it has a rail trail movement that has something like 30,000 miles of these sorts of tracks, and they have precedence for how they improve the quality of life and the visitors to small communities and the restaurants and other agencies like bicycle shops and that make for friendly interaction and give the Midwest some respect. It's often thought that the Midwest is flat and uninteresting, but if you look at the microclimates and the micro habitats and small things, it's a rather interesting place. It has history. It has people who've come from Tennessee and Kentucky and settled here, and you can almost hear it in the tone of the voices. So we're hoping, and we hope that you'll be interested in this complex and how it might be developed. We hold our breaths while we try to make connections between Whiteheath and Champaign. There's costs involved, but the cost is spread evenly across many generations, and so the cost per user over 50 years is rather low. So the expenditure now or whenever is spread rather thin. The bed is there. We don't have to create trails, and some of the history is also there. We do have other sites. We have a nice 9-acre prairie at Rantoul, north of Rantoul, but and that is a dreamland too, because we're hoping to use an old Route 45 road, 10 miles to Paxton, and a roadside habitat that's of interest. So go back to a picture that we often provide. You can see the railroad that we own and the mixed remnant and reconstruction prairie at Rantoul. We'll do a separate program on Rantoul. It requires a lot of leadership, and sometimes we are limited in that. We try our best, but we hope for leadership that includes computerization, it includes legalization, financial situations. It is some of these projects are totally dependent on active leadership, and that leadership needs to be convinced of what they're doing. It has to be part of their body and soul. So we have to have enough volunteers and others who look at their own soul and figure out if this is what they might want to be involved in, or we have to introduce them to the sorts of things that they might be involved in if they want to take another step. And then there's the hope that some of those people might be leaders who will work with the actual installation of a trail or a roadside habitat or a historic cultural artifact. I'm going to say thank you to WEFT for providing this opportunity, and to the Urbana Public Television that puts this program up on radio. In Zoom, we're doing this remote. They take the Zoom video and send the radio element to WEFT. Then if we are lucky to have the time and the technical opportunities, we put pictures in which would help you to understand our land ownership. And then that goes up on YouTube. So with a little bit of luck and a little bit of real effort, we can take this complex further. And we thank you for listening. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.